Today we are talking about the Thornton Affair and how this led to the start of the war. Exactly who is it that really started this war? We have three different ways we're going to look at the Thornton Affair. We're going to look at it just what happened, then we'll look at the U.S. perspective and the Mexican perspective. So let's get going. First of all, remember the disputed territory was the land claimed by both the U.S. and Mexico. So this is the land between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. Now, here it's called the Rio del Norte by President Polk. But the thing is, the reason this land was disputed is because the Texans who wrote the treaty giving Texas independence, they just wrote the Rio del Norte. But both of these were sometimes called the Rio del Norte by the people who lived there locally. So it was unclear which river they really meant. The U.S. claimed the Rio Grande as the border. Mexico claimed the Nueces River was the Rio del Norte. And so now, what happened there? You may already have watched this video. If you have not watched the video about the Thornton Affair, an Ed puzzle, please stop here and quickly go do that. Once you watch the video, then you are ready to complete the Thornton Affair 8-10 worksheet. So, these are your notes about the Thornton Affair. We're going to start with this first column. All you have to do with this is you circle either the U.S. or Mexico, which one was true. So, who annexed Texas? Was it the U.S. or Mexico? Who sent troops into the disputed territory first? Did American or Mexican troops meet them near Matamoros? So the U.S. sent troops into the disputed territory first. Who met them at Matamoros? Which side fired the first shots? And then which side, American or Mexican troops, killed or captured a small group of soldiers from the other side? Those are the basic facts that both sides agree on. Now we're going to take a look at the two perspectives. What does the U.S. say was really going on? What does Mexico say was really going on? They're very different from this point on. We will start by taking a look at what President Polk says. This will be document B in your DBQ packet. You don't have that yet, you'll get it later. But on your worksheet that you do have, go to page 2 and fill in. This is called ACAP's Author, Context, Audience, Purpose, and Significance. This is word for word what I have on my slide, so it should be an easy fill in the blanks. As we go along, pause the video if you need to at the end of this. James Polk was the President of the United States. That's who wrote this document. It's, of course, the United States perspective because he was the President of the U.S. Who is the audience? President Polk was writing this letter to the U.S. Congress, but the context is important. When was he writing this? He was writing it just after the first shots were fired in the war. He had just gotten the very preliminary report about what had happened at the Thornton Affair when he finished this letter. He had already been writing it before the Thornton Affair happened, or at least before he heard about the Thornton Affair. And when he got the information about the Thornton Affair, he quickly rewrote a big section of the letter so that he could include this as the reason that they should go to war. His purpose was to persuade Congress to declare war against Mexico. Now, that purpose is important when we think about how reliable the document is. How much should we trust it? So how reliable is President Polk? Two questions that we'll ask about documents to really evaluate how much we can trust them. Was the person who wrote it there? So was President Polk there at the Thornton Affair battle? The answer is no. He was alive during the time period, but he wasn't there. He didn't see it. He heard about everything from letters sent by people who were there. So he had good information to base it on, but he wasn't there. Second question is, does he have a reason to lie? Since President Polk is trying to persuade Congress, he has a reason to kind of fudge the truth a little to make it fit his purpose. He wants Congress to agree to go to war, and they might not agree if it seems like he started the war. There's quite a few who would not want to go to war if that was the reason. And so maybe he wants to kind of work in a few little white lies, or maybe some that are a little bigger than that, about exactly what happened. If the person was not there and they have a reason to lie, that makes it pretty hard to trust the source. I give it a 5 cactus score. Cacti poke holes in the reliability of a document. So there's a lot of holes in this, not very trustworthy. We're ready to take a look at the document itself now. So you guys are going to flip over back to the first side. We're ready to fill in this middle column. What did President Polk say? For you to figure out what goes in the blanks, you're going to use the words down here. You have nouns and adjectives that you'd put in some blanks here, and the verbs are a separate one over here. So decide which kind of word you need, and that'll help you know which list to look at. So we're going to start here. So the source that we're reading is the War Message of President James Polk, written in Washington on May 11th, 1846, or, delivered on May 11th. He wrote it for several days before that. It's written to the Senate and the House of Representatives. As I read this, notice that over here on the slide, you have words like informed that appear in the document. Informed, efficient, this phrase is in the document. And then over here in the other column, if you just go across on that same color line, it's something that means the same thing, a synonym. And so informed means told. Efficient means small. And so as I read, if I use a word that you aren't sure of what it means, look over here, it'll probably tell you. In an earlier message, I informed you that I had ordered an efficient military force to take a position between the Nueces and the Del Norte, by which President Polk means the Rio Grande. So, I'm going to pause there for a moment. Informed means told, efficient means small. So, in an earlier message, I told you that I had ordered a small military force to take a position between the Nueces and the Del Norte. This had become necessary to meet a threatened invasion of Texas by the Mexican forces. The invasion was threatened solely because Texas had determined to annex herself to our Union, and under these circumstances, it was plainly our duty to extend our protection over her citizens and soil. For right now, you're taking a look at what it says here, and you're figuring out what goes in the blank. So what did Texas want? I'm not going to go back and forth much, but make sure you're filling in these blanks as we go on from here. I'm going to give you a little help as you go through this. I'm going to read the section that answer comes from. And so I am going to look in this section. I might need these words over here. So what did Texas want? This had become necessary to meet a threatened invasion of Texas by the Mexican forces. The invasion was threatened solely because Texas had determined to annex herself to our Union. And under these circumstances, it was plainly our duty to extend our protection over her citizens and soil. So what did Texas want? Seems like it's here toward the middle. To meet a threatened invasion of Texas by the Mexican forces. Means because Mexico was threatening to invade Texas. But the why? The invasion was threatened solely because Texas had determined to annex herself to our Union. The next blank you need is I blanked Texas. So what did President Polk, because he's the one talking, what did President Polk do to Texas? What does he say he did? Ordinarily, I would look for the word like I. But what I realized is that's actually not where we're going to find the answer here. I'm going to tell you it's toward the end of this paragraph. Texas had determined to annex herself to our Union, and under these circumstances, it was plainly our duty to extend our protection over her citizens and soil. So what is President Polk doing to Texas? By sending troops to defend the border. He uses a word down here. And then the third box. Mexico was blank. What was Mexico doing to the United States? Or Texas, because Texas was part of the United States. So, what was Mexico doing? I see Mexican forces right here, so I'm going to focus at this. Mexico was, this had become necessary to meet a threatened invasion of Texas by the Mexican forces. The invasion was threatened solely because Texas had determined to annex herself to our Union. Now we're ready for the second paragraph. The Congress of Texas, by its act of December 19, 1836, had declared the Rio del Norte to be the boundary of that republic. The country between that river and the Del Norte is now included within one of our congressional districts. It became, therefore, of urgent necessity to provide for the defense of that portion of our country. If you didn't get it before, he just said again, what was he doing to Texas? So we're ready for the third paragraph. On the 24th of April, a party of 63 men and officers were dispatched from the American camp up the Rio del Norte on its north bank to ascertain whether the Mexican troops had crossed or were preparing to cross the river. Woo, there's a lot of vocabulary there. Okay, so on April 24th, a group of 63 men and officers were dispatched or sent from the American camp up to the Rio del Norte on its north bank to ascertain or see whether the Mexican troops had crossed. So they went up to see if the Mexican troops had crossed or were preparing to cross the river. They became engaged with, or started fighting with, a large body of these Mexican troops, and after a short fight, in which some 16 Americans were killed and wounded, they appear to have been surrounded and compelled to surrender. The next box on your chart says Mexican soldiers crossed the what? And blank did what to the U.S. According to President Polk, what were they doing? And we are ready for the last paragraph of document B. The word reconciliation means making peace, and the cup of forbearance is patience. Okay? To forbear means to have patience or to not respond. Here, President Polk goes into full politician mode. We have tried every effort at reconciliation. The cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte, but now Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. Pretty strong language there. If you didn't get it from the third paragraph, you should have gotten now what President Polk is saying the Mexican soldiers were doing to the United States. And now, the last box, Mexico has done what to Americans when they were still in whose country? Now that you have completed the middle column from document B, we're going to take a look at Mexico's perspective with document C. Before we get to reading the document, flip the paper over, and let's fill in the A caps for document C. Who is it? How reliable is this person? So document C comes from the author Jesus Velasco Marquez, who is a professor and an expert on the history of the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. He's a professor at a university in Mexico that specializes in U.S.-American relations in a lot of different ways. He happens to be an expert on the history, and he was actually quoted. He was one of the people you saw speaking in the video we watched. Whose perspective is this document from? This is from Mexico's perspective. The context, when did he write this? This is part of an article written for an academic journal many years after the war. I mean, he was on the video. You could see him live and in person. He clearly was not alive in the 1840s. Velasco Marquez's audience is historians and people who are interested in Mexico's relationship with the United States who would like to read this journal. So mostly historians. His purpose was to explain Mexico's perspective on the Thornton Affair. So thinking about that, how reliable is Jesus Velasco Marquez going to be? Was he there at the battle? No, like I said, we saw him on the video. He studied the war in depth on both sides, using primary sources though. So President Polk only had the one side of the story. Jesus Velasco Marquez has been able to study both sides of the story. So he was not there, but he has read primary sources more than what President Polk had. Does Jesus Velasco Marquez have a reason to lie? When you have somebody who's an expert and a professor, they try not to lie. So he doesn't really have a reason to lie. And if he wants to keep his job as a professor, he needs to stay respected by other historians and by the public and the people who run his college. So he's going to do his best to not really lie. Now, does he have a perspective? Does he have a bias? Sure. So overall rating, I give him 1 cactus. There's still going to be some things we need to say, wait, is this something that he's going to really tell fair and square? but he doesn't have a reason to lie like President Polk did. So not too bad. Watch out for a little prickly bias, but that's about all we have to worry about. The source for document C is Jesus Velasco Marquez from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, called A Mexican Viewpoint on the War with the United States, in the publication Voices of Mexico, issue number 41, from the Center for Research on North America, CSUN, from the National Autonomous University of Mexico in 2006. Here's what he says. The most dramatic event in the history of relations between Mexico and the United States took place a century and a half ago. U.S. historians refer to this event as the Mexican War, while in Mexico we prefer to use the term the U.S. invasion. Ooh, there's a pretty strong term right there, right? So refer means, what's what we call it. So in Mexico, they call it something different than we do in the United States. The first paragraph does not give us anything on the worksheet, and so we're going to go on to paragraph 2. From Mexico's point of view, the annexation of Texas to the United States was inadmissible for both legal and security reasons. Inadmissible means not allowable, not acceptable. Thus, when the Mexican government learned of the treaty signed between Texas and the United States in April of 1844, it would consider such an act a declaration of war. So the vocabulary there, the treaty that they're talking about that was signed between the Texas and the United States in April of 1844 was the Texas Annexation Treaty when the U.S. annexed Texas. And according to Mexico, their feeling on this, a declaration of war, which is the official start of a war. So taking a look, Mexico's perspective. Texas should still be part of Mexico. The U.S. adding Texas was like declaring what on Mexico? So in paragraph 3, it's going to talk about the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Those are just the early battles of the U.S.-Mexican War. In early 1846, on Polk's orders, the troops commanded by General Zachary Taylor arrived at the Rio Grande, across from the city of Matamoros, thus occupying the territory in dispute and increasing the possibilities of a confrontation. In the eyes of the Mexican government, the mobilization of the U.S. Army was an outright attack on Mexico. Ooh, alright, there's a lot there. So from Mexico's perspective, what was the U.S. doing to Mexico? As a consequence, so in the eyes of the Mexican government, the mobilization of the U.S. Army was an outright attack on Mexico. As a consequence, the Mexican government reaffirmed the instruction to protect the border, meaning the territory located between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, an order which led to the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. So a confrontation was a fight, or in this case, talking about the war. The mobilization of the U.S. Army, that means the movement of the U.S. Army, was an attack on Mexico. Now, the consequences is a result of it, and reaffirmed means repeated. So I'm going to reread that part. As a consequence, as a result, the Mexican government reaffirmed or repeated the instruction to protect the border, meaning the territory located between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. So what is Mexico saying it was just doing? We've already kind of said this. When the U.S. soldiers moved into the disputed territory, Mexico felt like it was a what? And then the Mexican military was doing what to its border? This last sentence in document C ends up in a lot of DBQ essays. It's very colorful. It helps us understand the idea. One article in the daily El Tiempo, which is a Mexican newspaper, stated or said, "The American government acted like a bandit who came upon a traveler." A bandit being a violent thief out in the country more, but still an armed robber, just not in town. You have one thing left on this back side of the worksheet, and that is at the bottom. We're going to compare the two perspectives. This is a targeted, this is for a grade, so make sure you answer these 3 questions very well. So first of all, you're kind of doing a summary. According to American President Polk, who was invading and who was defending? And the same question for Mexico. From the Mexican perspective, at document C, who was invading and who was defending? You should have some opposite answers here. So, since they have exactly opposite explanations of of who was at fault, so based on what you have learned so far, who do you think was more truthful? The U.S. or Mexico about this perspective, at least the sources we looked at. And why do you think that? This why is a huge part of being able to get a good score on this assignment. So make sure you give me a good sentence there. Give me a good reason based on something that is on the paper. Probably actually going to be about whose perspective and which author is more reliable, but there might be some other reasons you'd give. Please make sure you take a picture of the assignment and turn it in so that I can grade it. This is for 2 different scores. One is for how do you compare the viewpoints? The second score is for understanding the primary source, document B, what President Polk said.